The year is 1912. Henry Flagler rode into town via his newly built and much prized overseas railroad, making his the first train to reach Key West, Florida. The Republic of China was established. The African National Congress was formed in South Africa. Nabisco released the first Oreo cookie, love that for us. And on April 15th of 1912, a young woman stepped onto a ladder in what I imagine had to have been a shaken, sea-shattered daze. She likely would have clutched a luxurious fur coat tighter around her thin shoulders, her mind a frozen mess. She probably hardly heard the men when they asked her her name, but eventually she would have answered with Ellen Bird. At some point, Ellen would have glanced over her shoulder at what was a maritime graveyard, a near black and frigid ocean that hours before almost swallowed her up. Not everyone was so lucky, and as Ellen shifted about in a fur coat far more expensive than anything she'd ever owned herself, I imagined that two faces burned in the back of her mind. Ida and Isidor Straus, her employers for scarcely a moment, really, saved her life, and they did it by sacrificing their own. In Isidor's case, he refused to take a seat while any women or children were still on board the quickly sinking Titanic. And as far as Ida, well, she just wouldn't leave him. Instead, Ida took her coat off and she handed it to Ellen, and tearfully she told her that she wouldn't need it anymore. They are love and sacrifice manifest, an incredibly rare example of the 1% showing compassion and selflessness and humanity and loyalty and bravery in the face of a terrifying reality. And as the lifeboat, which at that point was only at half capacity, mind you, slipped away into the darkness, Ida and Isidor wrapped themselves in one another's arms and they faced the unknown together. And so starts another episode of Crown, Gilded, and Screwed. I'm your host, Cara Mae Adamo. If you're new here, welcome aboard. Thanks for joining us. Excuse my pun. We hope that you enjoy your time here. Basically, the gist of this show is we take a historical figure in history, generally somebody who is royal or is what I like to call royal adjacent, royal-ish, if you will. Anyone born with a position of prestige, with prominence and substantial privilege generally, silver spoon in their mouth, and as they say, and eventually they choke on it. The silver spoon tarnishes. Their fancy schmancy life that looks opulent and perfect from the outside becomes the very thing that closes in on them and kind of takes them down. Now, sometimes these people are players in their own downfall, but then other times they're not. Fate just sort of does its thing, and then, we talk about it. Today we're going to be talking about one of those royal-ish people, Isidor Straus, who at the time owned Macy's department stores with his brother Nathan. Now, Isidor and his wife Ida, as I said, died nobly on the Titanic, not because he didn't have the option to live, but because they sacrificed their own seats on a lifeboat so that others could survive, and also because living without one another was so inconceivable to them that they refused to be parted even when it meant certain death. Now, we don't usually get an opportunity to talk about, laud the selflessness of our subjects, so I'm actually kind of digging this one. Don't get me wrong, it's a tragedy, but it's also sort of a love story, and it's one of bravery and humility. And again, that's not generally common in our subjects. And it's also kind of a story of the American dream as well. So that's kind of fun too. So pull up, grab a chair, grab a drink. In my case tonight, it's going to be the punch romaine, which was served to first-class passengers as a sixth-course, quote-unquote, standalone drink. The night that the Titanic sank, they would have had this as a aperitif or a palate cleanser. We actually did an episode on this drink, so if you would like to learn more about it and check it out, there will be a link below. There is a frozen one, which this is, and then they also have kind of a modified fizz version, which is not frozen. So I did make instructions for both so that you can whip up some drinks real fast, drink along with me. Aside from that, let's kick back and chat about Ida and Isidor Straus, often considered the OG Jack and Rose of the Titanic. Let's do this. From Germany to the New World. To begin, we're going to dial it back to a different ship, crossing the same ocean, carrying the same dude, only this one sailed out about 60 years before the Titanic sank. So, like the Titanic, the St. Louis was considered the glory of her day. She was powered by paddles, by sails, and by steam, which back in the 1850s was sexy AF. Isidor at this point would have been about 9 years old, and he's traveling with his mom and his 6-year-old brother Nathan. And they are headed to the United States, where they plan to reunite with his father Lazarus. So back in Bavaria, where they're from, Lazarus had been a grain merchant and a farmland owner, but Germany was going through a bit of a revolutionary moment, and Lazarus found himself siding with those that wanted more of like a democratic constitution. It didn't take, though, and so while Lazarus was not held accountable to the extent that other revolutionaries around him were, he was definitely given a not-so-subtle warning that he'd better keep like his shit on lock. So he realizes things aren't going to be too cozy and that the future might be bleak at best if he sticks around. And so he goes ahead, he packs up, and he leaves his young family in Germany, and he sets up shop in the New World. And I mean that actually quite literally. Lazarus starts peddling out wares amongst the wealthier homes throughout antebellum Georgia. Basically, he would roll up, he'd show off clothing and perfumes, etc., hopefully sell some stuff, stay for dinner, and share news from town. In the time that he was gone without his family, he gained a reputation as an honest businessman and a really good friend. He had a phenomenal character. He had a dedicated client base as a result of this, and he managed to scrape together enough money to eventually bring his family over and into a relatively comfortable home in Georgia. So, Isidor and his mom and brother set off to join their dad in early September of 1854. And on the 8th of September, they would actually pass by 2 icebergs in the North Atlantic. And as men, the brothers would actually remember this rather fondly because if sentient, the universe has a fucked up sense of humor. Now, they docked safely and they sort of spent some time up north for a bit. And the reason for that is that there was actually a bad outbreak of yellow fever in Savannah, Georgia, known appetizingly as the Black Vomit. Yum. They weren't the only ones that kind of wanted to stay out of Dodge. The disease took out thousands of people, and by the time the Strauses arrived stateside, that fell like that fall, about 2/3 of the city had left town. And then, as if that wasn't harrowing enough, a godforsaken Cat 3 hurricane rolls up 4 days before they even touch land, and it kills an additional 26 people. And for those who are not familiar with hurricanes, they suck balls. I was born and raised in Florida, so hurricanes and I have a long-standing feud, and while a Cat 3 is not exactly a 5, I would argue sometimes it's even more dangerous because it's slower. The hurricane that hit Savannah that year was known to history as the Coastal Hurricane of 1854. And that's because we hadn't started giving them like people names until years and years later. It was 125 miles per hour compared to the 149 mile per hour one that took out my beloved hometown my senior year of high school, traveling directly over my parents' house and all of that. Hurricane Charlie might have been a powerful hurricane, but I can at least tell you firsthand that it was over quick. The one in 1854 had less wind power, but that also meant that it hung around. And along with downing trees and damaging buildings, it was lingering and it was festering and flooding streets, and that only intensified the water damage. So the Strauses see all of this and they're like, absolutely not. And they chilled up north and all of that and let southern weather handle its business. Antebellum, Georgia. All right, speaking of Florida, it is hot, and these lights are hot, so the hair went up. All right, where were we? Oh yes, so again, it is 1854, and Lazarus has set everybody up in the Deep South. Now, that does mean that by the time that the Civil War kicks in, they are on the side of the Confederacy. Now, later in life, Isidor was asked repeatedly by his children to write a memoir, which actually was painfully out of character with him because he was a super humble guy. But he did acquiesce out of affection for his children, and so he does write a handful of pages during the last year of his life. And they provide unique perspective into this time period for his family and give insight into what they were up to in, again, antebellum Georgia. I'm not going to brush over this as if it is not part of the story and their history. The Straus family did own slaves. They allegedly refused to buy any slaves. At first, they would just hire them from other owners nearby, but they treated them really well while they were working for them. And so, according to Isidor's younger brother, Oscar, His account is that the slaves would then beg the Strauses to buy them so that they could be treated with kindness and courtesy compared to how they had been treated back home with their actual owners. Supposedly, they were relatively benevolent owners, and they would even make sure that families were able to stay together whenever they could. Again, we do have to consider the source of this information, although none of this was ever disputed as far as I saw in my research. But always keep in mind that a lot of these families do say that after the fact, so I'm just putting it out there. It happened, and this was what they said about it. Lazarus himself, I will say, seems to have been torn over the whole consideration of slavery. According to Isidor's little memoir, he wrote for his kids, quote, "No such thing as perpetual bondage, as all slaves were declared free in the year of Jubilee," end quote. So that is what Isidor said that his dad would often say, but then he still owned fucking slaves. So I do have a rough time with this one because slave ownership is actually very out of character from everything else that I've ever read about these people. But I also don't want to be one of those YouTubers that just brushes over the shitty stuff and doesn't acknowledge it, so I am going to call it out. His dad owned slaves, and it was super shitty. I will also say that once it became clear that the war was coming to a close and emancipation was imminent, Lazarus seems to really want them to succeed at that point, and we know that because he paid for them to be trained as tailors and shoemakers, because I guess they'd become friends and they mattered to him, and he wanted to make sure that they were able to support themselves in this new sort of uncharted situation that they were now in. So yeah, when Isidor was growing up, they did briefly have slaves. I'm not going to downplay it. It happened, and you are absolutely allowed to feel however you want to feel about it. Believe me, I am with you. Fuck slavery, fuck racism, fuck the Confederacy. Signed, a woman born in the South, where people still fly that stupid traitor flag. I do think it's interesting that they were able to own them while also acknowledging that it was wrong. Again, history is filled with people who see the flaws in their actions and don't change fast enough. Either way, according to the 1860 census, there were at least 13 slaves listed in their household. Isidor would have been a kid at that time, and by the time he would have likely made the decision of whether or not to own them himself, the Civil War was already going on. So he personally never owned slaves. It is possible that he might have owned them, but it is also possible that he might not have. Again, it doesn't really align very much with what we know about his actual adult life as he did live it, and I'd like to give him the benefit of doubt. Plenty of us do grow up, of course, to have different value systems than the ones that we were, brought up with or that we came from, and it also sounds like Lazarus wasn't even super keen on the idea himself. It might not have been that much of a leap for Isidor to simply not participate. We will never know, because again, we are now into Civil War territory, and Isidor plays a strategic, but we'll call it morally ambiguous role during that time. Blockade runners and leaving New York. All right. So Isidor is 16 when the war breaks out, and up until this point, his family has evaded anti-Semitism because they are living in Georgia, and it hadn't really caught up yet compared to how it was up north. Now, Isidor had been doing really great in school, and he was interested in going to West Point after graduation, but he was still too young to go before the war broke out, and the one thing ended up leading to another, and his plans were thwarted. The Straus family had at that point been renting out a space to a boarder called Julius Kaufman. Julius, who was about my age at the time, was called to the battlefield as one of the so-called Southern Rifles. And because of this, Isidor actually dropped out of school for a year to help his dad out at the store in place of Julius, because Julius would work for his dad. And one might argue that this actually ended up being an instance of invaluable on-the-job training, considering what he ends up doing for his future career. Eventually, Julius comes back with an injury, and Isidor is now free to do whatever he wants to do with himself. And to be honest, he still really liked the look of a military uniform. So he decided to tour the Georgia Military Academy located in Marietta, which is kind of a suburb just outside of Atlanta. Now, while he's there are a bunch of essentially frat boys, and they do the thing that said boys always do. They haze him, and they do this by pulling the classic prank with a bucket of water at a doorway. It does not go over great. Isidor was apparently super put off by this and quote unquote disgusted that he left and never came back. Which, I mean, I guess you could call it bullying. I have a hard time with this a little bit too, because I am in my personal life, a little bit of a prankster sometimes, and I always mean it as heartless fun, and I only do it with people that I really, really care about, and they often do it back. So I see the kid's perspective on this, but like from Isidor's perspective, he did not know these kids, and you don't do that to like some rando. And he was probably, you know, insecure like a lot of little kids are, like I know I was, and you do feel bad for him a little bit and all of that. So I know that hazing is used as a gauge to see if someone can like hang and measure if they have a sense of humor. And I also recognize that it is not for everybody, especially if you don't even know the people and it's like your first impression of them. The fact is, either way, he obviously was not a cultural fit for these guys. He recognized it and he abruptly bounced. So know thyself. But now he's got some extra time on his hands and he's wandering around and he's looking for something to do. So he hires a buggy and driver and makes his way to a mill nearby. He places an order, and then the next day he sells everything that he ordered at a profit. And he then repeats this several times before he decides to return home and tell his parents he was not going to go to the Georgia Military Academy. So yeah, he didn't really gel with those dudes, but he had a knack for business, and above all else, our dude is motivated. And honestly, it just sounds like he was more of a serious kid, and he probably just didn't relate to kids his age. Kind of an old soul. He was really focused kind of from a young period in his life, and he actually probably would have succeeded at almost anything that he put his mind to. So that is true, but he obviously was not going to make a ton of friends at that military academy, which is fine. You know, if a plant isn't thriving, you repot it and you move it to a different spot. No harm, no foul. But to give an idea of Isidor's personality, he recalled that this little like business venture of his, and I'm going to quote him here, appeased the disappointment which an utter failure of the purpose of my trip would have caused. So a little uptight, a little wound up maybe, but definitely proactive and driven. So also yes. Now, regardless of which side you're on, war always sucks just across the board. And if you take away the atrocities and you only focus on the people at home trying to live their lives, that shit just blows. Not only are you sitting there like a nervous wreck and you're waiting for your loved ones to get home, but you're also just out of shit. Like all of the shit. Everywhere. Because pre-Civil War era America operated in so many ways, honestly, like it does now. Despite cultural barriers, the southern states relied heavily on goods being traded back and forth from northern states. And to be fair, that did go both ways. Isidor's little brother remembered his mother cutting up sweet potatoes into little cubes and drying them in the sun before she'd grind and roast them as like a substitute for coffee whenever they couldn't snag any coffee. So the problem was only further compounded by merchants in bigger cities with more resources, because they would send people out to buy up everything in smaller towns. So the result, of course, was scarcity in those areas and the inevitable price gouging. And then when you add in speculation and profiteering, which are, of course, forever war's twin economic wingmen, the issue becomes even worse. And this was particularly bad in the South, especially with the Union blockades of Southern Confederate ports. So basically, nobody could find anything, and as always, the country did it to itself. History often repeats itself. In case it isn't clear, despite my Southern upbringing, I am ethically speaking Team North, but still people in the South did suffer as a result of the economic drain that was everywhere. And that brings us back to a teenaged Isidor Straus, who is no longer looking to join the military, but he's also not really sure what he wants to do with his life. He has figured out that he's pretty good at turning profits on retail goods, but that at the moment is not the easiest way to make a living. It also needs to be noted here that while antebellum Georgia was not super anti-Semitic, again, they were obviously busy with different versions of racism, things did change during the war. A grand jury in Talbot County issued a public statement about, I'm going to quote them, the evil, unpatriotic conduct of the representatives of Jewish houses who had engaged in nefarious business, unquote. Again, history repeating itself. People never change. Now, this is referencing recent accusations toward Jewish people of profiteering and price gouging, which they were probably not doing any more than other ethnic groups, but, you know, tale as old as time, they decided to blame the Jewish people. So it becomes less and less friendly for people like Isidor to then make his mark during the war because of all this new anti-Semitism that Lazarus was trying to stay away from in the first place. Now, luckily for Isidor, Lazarus was not about to put up with that shit. And at this point, he had already moved the county from Talbot to Columbus. Now there, Isidor becomes acquainted with a group of businessmen who are in the middle of organizing the Importing and Exporting Company of Georgia, better known in its time as the B Company after its founder. Now, they essentially sponsored blockade runners. Blockade runners were like basically super fast cargo ships, and they were often painted to blend in with the water, and they would generally sneak out at night past Union blockades. The idea was to get out of blockaded ports so that the Confederates could trade internationally and counteract the negative economic impact of the war. Southern states would export goods like cotton in exchange for other supplies that were in high demand, and they would also use this as an opportunity to sell cotton shares or Confederate bonds. Blockade running was super dangerous, but the payout could be huge. Since Isidor wasn't going into a military academy and didn't necessarily want to go to the front to defend an increasingly anti-Semitic South, he decided to hedge his bets and join up with the B Company, riding a blockade runner called the Alice out of New York and down into the Bahamas. Just to give you an idea of the upfront costs of this, his ticket was not cheap. It cost about 1,120 Confederate dollars. It would amount to approximately $9,476.07 today. So not the cheapest ticket. We're talking $10K for a ticket, plus he has to pay for his own expenses. But in return, he's able to buy items in Europe and bring them back to Georgia to be sold there for a share of the profits. So as the draft is starting to look inevitable, his choice is kind of made for him. As the ship left the port, the captain ordered everyone on board to get down below deck. Isidor recalls sweating in the June heat and that it was made all the less bearable by the sheer weight of his clothing because his mother, Sarah, had sewn $1,200 worth of gold into his undergarments. So he's sticky from the heat and he's nearly passing out in this cramped ass space, and the rest of the men and him are all just sitting silently, and he's wearing gold. And he's terrified that cannons are going to fire into them as they're fleeing this harbor. That was the situation for a few hours, and then around 1 a.m. the crewmen opened the doors and they let them out into the night air. They had successfully snuck back past 17 Union vessels, which Isidor described as ironclads and monitors. I guess that's what they would have been called back then, and they were now on their way to Nassau. From the Bahamas, Isidor sails to Havana, and then he hoped to take the Corsica up to London. But he ends up getting derailed through a number of different little happenstance situations, and he finds out that the best way to get to London is actually via New York. So even though he just made it out of there, he then has to head back the way he came in order to make it to Europe safely. And then it turns out that the boat that he has chosen for this little back pedal of his has another passenger on it, and that passenger is the famous Union Admiral Charles Wilkes, who had just received notoriety for the Trent Affair, which basically is where he found and removed these Confederate officials that were hiding out on an English mailer, which is a boat carrying mail. The situation almost caused another whole ass war between the US and the UK, not 90 fucking years after the first one ended, but anyway, so now this guy, spyglass and all, is poised proudly on board this ship that Isidor is on, looking around in the water for a Confederate boat. 18-year-old Isidor, probably rocking that little patchy, prepubescent rat mustache y'all get, is standing there with his clothing that is lined with gold so that he can trade internationally behind the Union's backs. And he is stuck there watching this famous Union admiral, who, by the way, was not known for being a chill dude. Bro was fucking court-martialed eventually, but anyway. Isidor is stuck trying to play it cool as he sails back into the lion's den from whence he came. And as they pull into the harbor, there's all this commotion, so now he's freaking out for sure. And then someone shouts out that the Confederacy won the battle at Gettysburg. Now, this would have been a huge win for the South, and Isidor, whose family is in the South, has this moment of relief, because of course he, had to play it cool in front of old Charles Wilkes, but the Confederacy, his people. By the time he gets off the boat, though, they find out that all that news was incorrect. So he gets emotional whiplash from it, because the Union won the battle at Gettysburg and the war was far from won. So that means that the war is definitely still on, and he's got to get out of Dodge soon, but first he wants to make a pit stop. And that stop is to pay a visit to a man by the name of Nathaniel Bloom, who was the father of a family friend. So he visits Bloom in Philadelphia before he hops yet another boat to go overseas to Europe, and it turns out that Nate has a daughter, and her name is Ida, and she's cute. So for double the fun, the two teenagers found out that they were actually even born on the same day, only they were 4 years apart, so they share a birthday, so now he's kind of got like his little in, and they sort of bond and they giggle over this. And nothing else really happens at this point because she's only 14, but he definitely bookmarks it in the back of his head, and then he continues on his merry way towards Europe. So ever interested in ships, the craft that he initially chose for this was the Great Eastern, which was at the time considered the wonder of its age. And again, this is where we start to see a pattern of how much into fancy ships Isidor is. He was always fascinated by them, which I kind of get. I'm into cars, and a girlfriend of mine actually really likes planes and jets, so it is kind of cool to see new technology. And if you're into luxury, experiencing the newest and best thing is also very fun. So this trend sort of continues on throughout his life. He probably would have been a car guy, honestly. And he always goes out of his way to board the newest and most modern boats, leading, of course, to his decision to book passage on the Titanic much later in life. Unfortunately, it is getting too dangerous at this point to stay in the United States, and so he doesn't want to wait for that boat, and he changes his mind at the last minute, and he boards the city of Baltimore instead, which was a ship, not obviously the entire city of Baltimore. That ship was going to be able to leave New York 10 days earlier than the original ship. And Isidor, thank God he actually chose this ship because he made it just in time. The draft is announced within a day or two of the city of Baltimore slipping over the horizon. Europe, New York, and Ida Bloom. The city of Baltimore was actually owned by the Liverpool, New York, and Philadelphia Steamship Company, which means that it actually flew the Union Jack. Now, importantly, England sympathized more with the South during the Civil War, so everyone on board was more or less fine with them being from Georgia, so he didn't have to hide as much. He had made friends with a guy that was on board the ship as well, and they kind of stuck together. Now, while in Europe, Isidor does decide to visit some of his family members, like his grandparents, and he works within his family to trade and sell Confederate bonds. This was done in addition to trading resources to help bolster the Confederate economy during the war. About a year in, a guy named Henry Lafone offered Isidor 15 pounds per month to track a guy down named Rosenberg and give him money, which Isidor actually does succeed in doing in Germany. And then he follows him to New York and shakes him down in New York as well. And then when he is in New York, ever the opportunist, Isidor drops in to chat up Ida. So he finds this guy, makes his money, chats up the girl, and then he returns to London to carry on with like his investments and stuff. So at some point he has this whole thing where he's basically a bounty hunter. At one point he runs into a guy named Henry Bloom, who is actually Ida's cousin. And Henry was a blockade runner from Savannah, so they had some of that in common, and they actually had a brief friendship while Henry was in England, and then he went back to the United States after his furlough from the Confederate Army, which was why he was in Europe at the time. Isidor's financial endeavors do kind of go up and down during this period. He loses money for his family, then he gains it, then he loses it again, then he gains more, and it's kind of up and down like that, like a roller coaster. And by 1864, he seems to have changed his perspective overall of the war effort. He starts pulling away from the Confederate cause, and he urges his family to start thinking a little bit more progressively in terms of their investments and their focus. He does suffer a bad enough loss around this time, right before the end of the war, which kind of cured him of any more speculative gambling or like investing. So that these time periods kind of align with each other. So more or less he's like learning his lesson, and he's also politically kind of distancing. Eventually the war does come to an end, and Isidor sails back from England having amassed a decent $10,000 in gold by trading the Confederate bonds. And this is actually a decent amount of money because today it would be the equivalent buying power of just over $198,000. So a fifth of a mil, not too shabby, considering the alternative. Now, Columbus was absolutely decimated during the war, and when Isidor comes back, having been, out of the sort of culture of the Confederacy, he looks around and he decides that it's in his and his family's best interest to basically get the hell out of there. I'm sure it didn't hurt that there was also a pretty brunette up north either, but Isidor, either way, was definitely coming home just in time. At this point, the Confederate dollar was essentially worth nothing, and his earnings over his time in Europe, which remember he's bringing back in gold, which he can change into Union dollars, that was basically all the whole family had. So he is fortunately able to weigh in with his father, who has a near perfect reputation as a businessman up and down the eastern seaboard. And at one point, Lazarus wasn't even able to pay some of his debts to vendors that he'd worked with. And they actually, out of the kindness of their hearts, offered to clear his debts for him. And he said no, and I'm going to quote him here because this gives a sense of who Lazarus was. "I propose to pay my debt in full and leave to my children a good name, even if I should leave them nothing else." And this works. By the time Isidor comes back and links up with Lazarus, his word was his bond. And that transfers rightfully on to his sons, who carried the same value system throughout their own lives. So Lazarus definitely was leading by example, and it ends up paying off in the end. It becomes social currency for the family. Isidor helped pay off all of those family debts, and this leaves them about $6,000 in gold. So with that leftover money, they established L. Straus and Sons. They opened their doors on June 1st in 1866, and while it was a tough start, they did manage to gross a $60,000 profit in their first year, which in today's money would be roughly $1.2 million. Not too bad for a 21-year-old kid. He also looked out for his kid brothers, and he wanted them to have all the educational opportunities that he felt that the war kind of took for him. So he pays for Nathan to attend what eventually became Packard's Business College, and Oscar eventually goes to Columbia. Isidor also purchased a house for the family. It was conveniently 11 blocks up from Nathan Bloom, who at this point lived in Manhattan. And as we all know, Nathan Bloom has a daughter named Ida. So, he'd drop in on Ida and all of that because, he was always in the neighborhood. And the two of them really did hit it off. Ida did not mind in the least. They had a lot in common. Not only were they both born on February 6th, but they were both German-American immigrants. Both of their fathers were merchants and had started from the bottom and, were now in a good place. And they had similar interests and values. They absolutely were the PDA couple. They flirted with each other in front of people, and they did so unabashedly throughout their lives. At one point in 1869, Isidor travels out to San Francisco, and he stays there for a 5-week business trip. And the purpose of this trip is to visit his uncle Emanuel Straus, who's his dad, Lazarus's brother. Emanuel opened a crockery and glassware company that he called Hebling and Straus, and Isidor and his uncle established a partnership between the two. And this allowed Isidor to start carrying china and imported glassware in New York City. So despite this success, though, Isidor was kind of preoccupied. And he notes to everybody in quotes that he was anxious to be in New York on February 6th, for I had lately learned that there was another person in whom I took some interest at that time who also had the same birthday. My boy's got it bad. He did get home 2 days late, though Ida evidently forgave him for missing their birthday because she does say yes when he pops the question in April 24th of that same year. So these two lovebirds get married on July 12th, and Isidor referred to it as the important, happy event of my life. So this was in every way a love match, and he was smitten. Family life and the start of Macy's. For the most part, it looks like Isidor and Ida's family life was a really happy one. He was rich and successful, but he did always make time for his family, and their house was constantly filled with guests whose invitations, according to one source, in quotes, were issued solely by a possible guest's capacity for being interesting, which is actually also the rule in my house. And often these invitations would be super, super last minute, which is not the rule in my house. Isidor would just randomly come home and announce that so-and-so was coming to dinner. But Ida liked having people over as much as he did, so they loved having a huge house full of kids, full of friends and family members, and everyone was always talking and eating and playing together, and it was a lively atmosphere all the time. And while we're on the subject of kids, these two had 6 surviving children, 7 in all. All 6 of these kids played musical instruments, so they basically had the fucking Brady Bunch on top of this, or the Partridge Family, depending on which one you gravitated towards. So everyone in the family would join together and they'd all play music together, which honestly, like as corny as that is, it sounds actually amazing. The family also lived in luxury very early on. Isidor liked the finer things in life. He actually did have one of the first porcelain tubs in New York City. In order to install it, he had to reinforce like the floors with beams, and that actually rose the bathroom floor up about 6 inches higher than everything else on their like second floor. But I doubt anybody cared because they had indoor plumbing with a porcelain tub, so it was a flex. And all in all, basically life was good at home and it was good at the store. Lazarus and Sons was doing fantastic. They continued to delve into imported European goods, and that took Isidor abroad on a lot of buying trips. But he was like an avid letter writer, and him and Ida corresponded constantly when they weren't around each other. Like honestly, like these two would have been super into text messaging and FaceTiming. They were in every capacity best friends, living a very, very fortunate life together. And meanwhile, Nathan is coming into his own as a salesman. And in March of 1874, with the brazen balls of a 26-year-old kid on the come up, he marches into the office of Roland H. Macy himself, who owned Macy's department store. He had 2 china plates stuffed under his arm and a mission. Whatever Nathan said worked, because he walked out of that meeting with permission to lease a 25 by 100 foot space in the basement of Macy's to sell imported china. This became Nathan's sort of passion project, and before long, he and Isidor had repeated the same formula in Wanamaker's out in Philly, and then again in Woodward and Lothrop, which was in DC. So now it just so happens that Roland Macy had a kid, and that kid was apparently kind of a fuck up. And it was so bad that Roland, who initially wanted to give his son the family business because, you know, nepotism, actually changed his plans entirely, saying in his will that I am grieved to say that I cannot trust him, in, you know, his son, with the care or management of any property. So instead, he decides that he wants to partner up with his nephew Robert and a man named Abel LaForge, who was sort of the son that Macy never had. Him and Robert, who is his nephew, they become partners with Macy. But then Macy dies, very unexpectedly. He had Bright's disease. And then right after that, LaForge gets sick and he dies from lung hemorrhages. And so that leaves Robert, who is the nephew of Macy. And Robert has this weird sort of jealousy thing with Isidor and Nathan over their recent success, even though their success benefits him, but you know, he was insecure, I guess. So Robert partners up with his cousin Charles and actually plans to muscle the Strauses out, but then he gets sick with what was called congestion of the lungs, and he dies at only 28 years old, the poor guy. But now that leaves Charles Webster, who decides that he wants to partner up with his brother-in-law, Jerome Wheeler. All of that to say, Wheeler and Webster actually really like the Strauses, and they decide that they want to keep them on and renew their lease. After 8 years, though, the two of them realize that they do not, by any stretch of the imagination, gel. Wheeler and Webster were fighting all the damn time, and it actually got so bad that everyone around them basically just told them that they needed to stop working together, and they agreed. So Webster ends up buying Wheeler out at first, but then he realizes that now it's a whole lot of work that he didn't have before, and he doesn't necessarily want to take all of that on after all. He just wanted to take the company from Wheeler. So he sits down with Nathan and Isidor Straus, and the three of them decide that the Strauses are actually ultimately going to become half owners. They would take over the portion that Wheeler had sold him. So he would have the original amount that he already had, they would have Wheeler's portion. So they go from almost being X'd out of the whole thing to now they are part owners at Macy's. So as of January 7th, 1888, Isidor and his brother were part owners. Now, in the meantime, their brother Oscar is becoming a trial lawyer, and eventually he found his voice in politics as well. And the Strauses by now have become really good friends with Grover Cleveland and his wife. So Oscar actually became integral to Cleveland's campaign. Basically, they maintained a really close friendship for Isidor's entire life. So safe to say, the family has become a veritable powerhouse. They're wealthy, they're well-connected, they're happily married. They all loved what they did for a living, and they were very, very active when it came to social issues. Even Ida, like, she was a housewife the way, you know, it was always set up back then, but she had her own personal projects. She actually wrote and published poetry, some of which spoke out against the plight of Jewish people in Russia at the time. One of her poems was published called To the Tsar, a Prophecy. Neither her nor Isidor were particularly religious people, and they actually considered Zionism a super dangerous dogma, but they also spoke out against anti-Semitism too. So to give you an idea of where they stood with it, to quote Isidor, "I look upon Zionism as a dangerous dogma for us in this country. If the new immigrants who arrive here by the hundreds of thousands during the course of a few years, and of whom the Educational Alliance is trying to make American citizens, are met with the dogma that this country is only a tarrying ground for an ultimate home in Palestine, it places in the hands of the anti-Semites, as well as those who are opposed to immigration, a weapon which can be used with the same force as the sentiment which gave rise to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and has raised on the Pacific coast the trouble with Japan. I thoroughly agree with Schiff that Zionism is incompatible with patriotism. If Zionism means a home for the Jews, I am radically opposed to it. If it simply means a spiritual home for the oppressed and persecuted people of Russia, Romania, and Galata, it is a different proposition. But political Zionism, or Zionism in any shape, manner, or form, is a propaganda in this country I have no patience with and am utterly and irrevocably opposed to it." So again, he was fine with Jewish faith, obviously, and the Jewish identity, but he was very ardently not a Zionist. You know how you can have both, just saying. I will say that Nathan, on the other hand, eventually does take a trip to the Holy Land in 1904, and he came back very pro-Zionism. And if there was anything that the two of them fought about during like the later part of their lives, it was actually that subject. Nathan had another special interest, that socially speaking, that Isidor actually could get behind though, and that was the interest of child mortality rates. He started studying up on it and determined that the problem was that kids were drinking raw milk. So in 1898, about 10 years into being part owner at Macy's, he takes his considerable resources and he built a milk pasteurization plant on Randall's Island. Then he personally paid to have milk stations established throughout the city to provide safe pasteurized milk for children. Death rates as a result of this endeavor significantly dropped among the kids who drank the pasteurized milk, and this led the New York Board of Aldermen to pass an ordinance that required the entire city's milk supply to be pasteurized. Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time, and he saw this and launched a national milk study via the Public Health Service, and because of this, death rates among young children dropped nationally. So this is all because, like, Nathan saw the problem with raw milk and, got things going. Looking at you, RFK Jr. In 1891, Isidor also worked to help raise $125,000 to build the Educational Alliance building, and then he became president of that alliance, and he worked to help refugees build a life in America, reaching down to help those who were in the shoes that he remembered wearing himself. So the brothers took their progressive social stances and they ran with them, and they actually also carried them on into the workplace. They established a dining hall in their building that offered low-cost lunches and free milk and coffee to their workers, and a program was even established that covered medical bills and retirement for the elderly and even funeral expenses. Again, this is the late 1880s, and companies today still have to be strong-armed into that sort of thing in America, but here Isidor and his brother were giving a damn about people before the 20th century even began. Eventually, they even actually bought up 350 acres of land in New York, and they built an affordable vacation site for their workers and their families, and they provided the transportation to and from the site in case somebody didn't have a car. So the cost for staying there was about $6 a week, which in today's money would only be $240 a week. Good luck finding an Airbnb for that. And that's with inflation. So they went out of their way to subsidize vacation time. Then in 1909, they actually purchased a larger 30-room country house, and that was sectioned off to be used as a summer home exclusively for female employees. So they could have a girls' trip together in a safe space. In 1909. Were Isidor and Nathan rich? Absolutely, totally. But these were one percenters without a question. But in a world of Carnegies, be the Strauses. The ship of dreams. By the 1910s, business was booming, and Isidor is starting to get up there in age a little bit. And gradually, his own sons had gone through schooling, and they went through training, and ultimately they started taking over more and more responsibilities at Macy's. Now, I will tell you, Isidor forced his kids to basically start, for lack of a better term, in the mailroom. He did not just hand them opportunities, he made them go to school, and then they had to like stock shelves. So he was also not super into just unearned nepotism. Did they get a leg up? Of course they did, but he made them prove their worth, so hats off. Their kids began marrying, and eventually they end up having families of their own, and Isidor and Ida are happily transitioning into the role of grandparents. They'd also begun taking yearly vacations away from like the shitty New York like winters, and they found themselves kind of vacationing in Europe more often because the weather was better for Ida's health. She'd been having a little bit of trouble with her heart over the years. So in January of 1912, they did just that. And they set off for a 3-month European tour that ended in a little village along the French Riviera called Cap Martin, and there they stayed in a hotel that overlooked the Mediterranean. At one point, Nathan and his wife Lena were actually nearby, and they stopped into Cap Martin on their way to Egypt, and the four of them ended up spending the day together. They did make plans to meet up again, but Isidor received news that profits were dipping just a little bit at the store. I get the feeling that Isidor just had anxiety in general, and his sons tried to convince him to just like leave it alone and that things would be fine, but Isidor, for whatever reason, is really hung up on this, and he's too stressed out. Like, he's just not enjoying his time anymore. So he decides that he would feel much better if he cut his trip a little shorter. He was gone for 3 months, and he starts looking around for other boats that he and Ida can take to head home and help out at the store. So he originally books passage on the Olympic, which was a ship that was owned by the White Star Line. The plan was for him and Ida and her new maid, Ellen Bird, who they hired while in Europe after their original maid like ran off with some guy she met while they were on the trip. Totally different story. And then Isidor's kind of manservant butler, John Farthing, was also with them. So the four of them are originally supposed to board the Olympic and set sail on April 19th. Now, the Olympic had been having some trouble, even though it had only been basically on the water for a year. It had already been back for repairs twice, and soon they were told that their trip was going to be delayed for yet another week because they had more repairs to do on this ship. There was also a coal strike. The White Star Line was being a little bit more frugal with how often they were sending ships out, and really the crown jewel for them was actually this brand new ship, the Titanic. So they were more interested in getting people on board that ship for the maiden voyage, and so they start advertising it everywhere. And remember, again, like the whole reason that they're even booking this trip is that Isidor is stressing the hell out about the store, even though his sons are like, chill, it's fine, don't know why you're all freaked out. He's helicopter parenting, and so essentially instead he catches word that, you know, the real big ship, the most amazing experience from the White Star Line is actually about to make this maiden voyage, and she's the biggest and the fastest and the most luxurious ship ever built. And you know how we all have that friend that is like super into cruises, you know, like the one that's like always knows about the newest boats, always knows about the newest restaurants on the ship. And, you know, I feel like every friends group has that one person that's like weirdly into it. Isidor would have been that friend. So he's all excited now because he gets to be on this cool ship. And though he doesn't quite pull the trigger right away, he does wait a little while to see if his brother is going to get back in touch with him about meeting up. Nathan and his wife are nowhere to be seen. They're like from Egypt en route to Palestine, and he can't get a hold of them. Even though that's happening, and even though his son Percy is writing consistently to figure out why his dad is so hell-bent on coming back early, Isidor is like, this is what we're doing. I'm going to board the Titanic. Honestly, I think he was mostly just stoked about the boat. It went from like concern about things back home to, oh my God, I get to hang out on this dope ass ship. And I just get the sense that really that became like the draw for him. So they end up booking first class tickets on the Titanic, and they stayed in the deluxe parlor suite on the port side. These rooms, which by the way cost the equivalent of just under $44,000 in today's money, were fucking gorgeous. They were decked like corner to corner in Louis the 16th like furnishings and like, you know, not furnishings, but like decor, like that style. It even included a 50-foot private promenade deck. This suite was originally reserved for J. Bruce Ismay, who was the chairman of the White Star Line at the time, so these are top-notch accommodations. It was actually such a beautiful suite that James Cameron used it as the basis for Rose DeWitt Decatur's rooms in his 1997 smash hit Titanic. So Literally, like when they walk in and she's talking about how like these rooms could use a little color with the her Monet paintings and Picasso paintings, when they're walking around that room and when Jack draws her, that was designed almost exactly after Ida and Isidor Straus's cabins. So very famously beautiful rooms. They were, along with John Astor and Molly Brown, honestly some of the wealthiest people on board, and that's why they would get those accommodations. Before they left, they caught word that their son Jesse and his wife Irma would be sailing to Europe from New York on the America, spelled with a K. And the two couples excitedly planned to pass one another and like send out a message via Marconi, which is what they would have called the telegraph that was on board the ship. So on April 14th, on Sunday, the two of them go down to the inquiry office on the starboard side of the ship, and they pay 12 shillings, 6 pence to send up to a 9-word message. The message that they chose to send: fine voyage, fine ship, feeling fine, what news? They were not the only people on board who were excited to use the Marconi. Poor Jack Phillip, who was the telegraph operator on board, was absolutely overwhelmed, and he starts to get kind of bitchy throughout the day. This is one of those crazy moments where if things had been perhaps just a little bit calmer, or maybe if the dude had had some fucking Xanax or something, he might have been cooler and just chill that day. And maybe around 9 a.m., when warnings about a large chunk of ice started coming in over the wire, Jack would have noticed. But he was only human, and passengers were coming in like crazy all day long, and customers can be a bitch, as we all know if you've worked in the service industry. So instead of paying attention to the official reports, he focuses on appeasing those customers. So for instance, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Jesse and Irma's boat, again the America, sent out a message via Marconi saying, quote, America passed 2 large icebergs in 41 degrees 27 minutes north, 50 degrees 8 minutes west on the 14th April, end quote. These messages continued coming in from various different ships that day, and for whatever reason, between Jack Phillips and Captain E.J. Smith, they fell on deaf ears. Now, the last message warning the Titanic about ice came from the Californian at just before 11 p.m., and it said, quote, we are stopped and surrounded by ice, end quote. But by this time, Jack's exhausted, and he's pissed. And he's also an hour away from clocking out for what has been a ridiculous hell shift. So he responds with, quote, shut up, exclamation point, I'm busy, I'm working Cape Race, end quote. This pisses off the telegraph operator for the Californian, Cyril Evans, because he's like, bro, I'm just trying to help you, but okay, like, fuck you, dude. So he does the 1912 equivalent of slamming his laptop down and goes to bed. Less than 1 hour later, the Titanic strikes an iceberg, probably the exact same one that the California tried to warn them about before Jack lost his shit. And since they were only about 10 miles away from the Titanic. But again, their telegraph operator, Cyril, is also pissed off now, so he's gone to bed early. So they're not receiving any distress calls when the Titanic hits the ice. So since Jack lost his cool, the one vessel that could have helped did not even know that they were in trouble, because as far as they knew, they warned them. So now we don't know exactly where Isidor and Ida were when the ship hit the iceberg. There are 2 major accounts, and both are sort of attributed to Ellen Bird, who you might remember again is the maid from the beginning of this rather long story. And if you're still with us, thank you. But the first story is that the 2 of them were strolling on deck after dinner, but honestly, I kind of doubt it. They were in their 60s at that point, and Ida was not exactly in the best health. My best guess is that the second version is more likely, which is that they were in bed when the ship hit the ice, and then they were woken up. Regardless, they were eventually seen afterwards wearing their bathrobes. Again, this to me tells me that they were in bed at the time. And then one of the officers told them about the iceberg, and he suggested kind of casually that they might want to snag some life jackets as a precaution. Because remember, everyone's thinking that this ship can't sink because, well, they said it couldn't sink. All of the ads at this point that have been leading up to this trip have been saying nonstop that this thing is unsinkable. But Ida isn't stupid, and her spidey senses are going off. And so she tells Isidor, Ellen, and John Farthing that she doesn't really care what he's saying. She wants to get dressed just in case this is worse than they're saying it is. So they all agree with her and they get dressed. Ida brought along a little gold purse that was encrusted with diamonds and emeralds that Isidor had purchased for her in Paris. So she was seen clutching this little purse, and they stood on deck and chatted with other passengers for a bit, because what else are you gonna do? Well, you kind of wait it out, you know? Like a fire alarm goes off and you're finding out if it's anything. You're kind of sitting there in a daze. So at first, it doesn't really look like anything's wrong. People are picking up pieces of ice off the deck, they're strolling around. Some people are drinking some brandy, but no one's really panicking. But eventually, the ship starts to tilt. And then, a moment later, silence. Because the engines had stopped. Crewmen started suggesting that passengers put on life vests if they haven't already, and they begin uncovering and lowering some lifeboats, and they are at this point still telling everybody that it is as a precaution. Some people actually refused to get into these boats because they didn't think it was necessary, and the crews try to play it cool or possibly even think it's fine. So, you know, because this is Titanic, for God's sake, it can't sink. Isidor and Ida, they had already traveled by boat many times at this point, so they're a little bit more of like seasoned travelers, and they're taking things at this point a little bit more seriously than the other people around them. Now, the Strauses were waiting with their friends, like the Astors, the Lambton sisters, Colonel Gracie was with them, and so was Edith Evans. And they are all on the port side of the ship, and that means that they are on the front left side as opposed to the starboard side, which is on the front right side of the ship. And then, of course, you have the stern in the back. So this is important because the port side was being managed by Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Now, Lightoller was very strictly adhering to E.J. Smith's women and children first rule. Had they been on the starboard side, where First Officer William Murdoch was in charge of things, it would have been different because Murdoch was only following those rules up to a point. When there wouldn't be women or children nearby, he would then fill up the rest of the boats with men, ensuring that the lifeboats were more or less close to capacity. But on Lightoller's side, half-empty boats were dropping into the water, which break the fucking rules if the alternative is to drop half-empty-ass boats into the ocean. Like, of all of the stupid... Anyway, so they're on narc-ass Lightoller's side. So when Ida is helped onto Lifeboat 8, Isidor steps back and he makes way for women and children. At that point, Ida looks back at him and she says, "Aren't you coming, Isidor?" And he says, "No, I can't. It's impossible." So she immediately is like, "Nope, fuck that." And she scrambles out of this boat. Remember, she's 65. And she like scrambles out of this boat and she rushes to him. And she says, "Where you are, Papa, I shall be." And then she turns to her maid, Ellen, and that's where she says, "You go, I must stay with my husband." She takes her fur coat off and she hands it to her and says, "I won't need this anymore, you take it." So Ellen takes Ida's place into the boat and then they lower it down at about 1:10 in the morning. But the fucking issue I have with this whole thing is that by now everyone knows that there weren't enough lifeboats on board. Like, it's very famously part of the story, you know, and even in the movie, like Kate Winslet and Victor Garber, who plays the ship's architect, Thomas Anders, they're like walking on the deck, and Kate, who's playing Rose in the movie, even notices that there aren't enough lifeboats for everyone, and Anders is glib about it, and he basically mansplains to her and tells her that it's, you know, she shouldn't worry her pretty little head about it, which is all annoying enough. But forget Tom's bullshit. Lifeboat 8 had a total capacity of 65 people, and it lowered into the water with 39 of those spots taken. As in, another 26 people could have been in that one boat alone that were not in it, because Lightoller is weird about the rules. So old Lightoller is a goddamn Boy Scout and inarguably lost 26 people their lives on that boat alone. But sometimes you have to break the rules, for fuck's sake. Now we're about an hour or so until the, you know, to quote the movie, its whole ass is sticking up in the air. So they make their way down to Deck A, and that's because Deck A is glassed in, and Ida at this point is now shivering. At this point, Madeline Astor, who by the way was super pregnant at the time, notices Ida, and she waves over to her because they were friends, and she waves to her and asks her to come join her in Lifeboat 4 and snag a seat. But again, Ida tells her that she will not be separated from Isidor. So she very famously said, quote, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so we will die together." So someone else shouts out that they can both go because, again, there's fucking room. But Isidor actually stays put. And he says very quietly that, quote, "As long as there is a woman on this vessel, I will not leave. When they are safe, then come get the men," unquote. So then someone else says, "You're an old man, Mr. Straus." And Isidor turns to them and he goes, "I am not too old to sacrifice myself for a woman." The big dick energy, my God. So by now the sailors are pissed off and they're over this dumb bullshit and they frankly don't have time for it anyway. So one of them actually grabs Ida and they're pulling her toward the boat and she screams out Isidor's name and she like grabs for his hand. But now they're kind of playing like this tug of war with this 65-year-old first-class woman on a slanted-ass ship deck while the band plays and people are all freaking the fuck out. So eventually, Ida actually grabs the railing and she wraps herself around it like a damn spider monkey and resists the tugs and pulls of grown-ass sailors and other women seated inside of the lifeboat. Like, she outlasts them. So eventually they're like, all right, fuck this. So they let go. And she runs to Isidor and basically hides in his arms. He probably knew that this wouldn't work, but he does try to change her mind. And he said, please, please go into the boat. And she shakes her head and she says, "Isidor, my place is with you. I have lived with you. I love you. And if necessary, I will die for you." And as their friends were lowered into the water, they heard her say, "I have lived with you for 40 years. I have loved you, and I would rather die with you than live without you. We are as safe here as anywhere, and I am happy to be with you wherever you are." That's such an incredible moment. She's 65. She's still got years ahead of her, and if she changes her mind. But none of that really matters because her life is right in front of her, and he's stroking her hair. And I mean, I think that that's actually what pulls me to Ida and Isidor. I've mentioned before on this show that I almost died, and it was actually last year in April. In April, wow, yeah, it's actually in April 7th. And I almost drowned in a river in Hawaii, and it was right as I was about to get swept away in a riptide. Someone leapt into the water and they pulled me out just in time. And when I looked, I recognized the tattoo of that person because it was actually my partner. It was our producer, Chaz McNeese. He had run down the bank and he leapt 15 feet into the air and landed in the river, and he saved my life. And he is the only reason that I'm here. He's the only reason that we both made it out of a really harrowing situation. And when someone is willing to face death just to be with you, because to them there is no other alternative, it's this incredibly rare thing. And that's who these people were. That's who Ida was. She wasn't going to leave her husband behind, her person behind. She chose to face a freezing, terrifying death with him. Not just because she didn't want to lose him, it was probably also because she didn't want him to die that way alone. He was never abandoned, not for one moment. And Archibald Gracie was interviewed after he was rescued, and his final account of the Strauses was, quote, "When the ship settled at the head, the two were engulfed by the sea that swept her." Isidor's body was recovered the next day. It was buried in a ridiculously large ceremony, and to be honest, I may actually do a shorter little, maybe just a short on that funeral because it was nuts. It was a whole fiasco in of itself, and literally thousands of people ended up there, and they actually broke a platform. It was a whole thing. And they actually had to cancel the funeral just to reschedule it for a different day because it was such a crowd hazard because they were so loved by everyone. So that was Isidor's funeral, but Ida's body was never found. As such, his grave serves as a site for them both in the family plot, and Ida remained buried at sea. Wendy, Stockton, and the OceanGate 5. On June 18, 2023, billionaire Stockton Rush and 4 others, including a 19-year-old kid, were packed inside of a small submersible being operated, I swear to God, by a wireless Logitech F710 gamepad controller. They communicated back and forth with Stockton's wife, Wendy, and the rest of their team at OceanGate, a marine tourism startup that was hell-bent on making going down to the Titanic recreationally feasible. Now, as evident by the fact that they were literally using a video game controller to steer it, Stockton and Wendy cut some major corners to keep costs low, and that included using a carbon fiber hull against the advice of literally everybody they talked to. Now, they'd made a few successful trips down at this point, including one dive with Macklemore, of all people, but they weren't super honest about which of the hulls had been successful and how many times each of them had gone down and what those testing results were. And by the time this trip was scheduled, they were essentially hemorrhaging money. At some point during this trip, the hull pops and the entire thing implodes not 500 meters from where Isidor and Ida Straus went down with the original ship. The kicker here? Ida and Isidor had kids, and then those kids had kids, and then those kids had a daughter, and that daughter was Wendy Rush, as in Stockton's wife. Full circle. Life is wild, man. So anyway, I just wanted to add that little extra part at the end there. Something tells me her ancestors probably would have been a little more careful with how they ran that company, but gonna leave that aside. It's all alleged right now. Read the reports, watch the documentary. It's fucking crazy. Anyway, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked this one, please smash that like button, subscribe, share it out, spread the word, tell your friends. Let me know if you enjoyed the drink too. I'll link it out. Like I said before, we'll link out that episode. We're calling it our happy hour segment, so we'll make the drinks and drink them together. So yeah, if you haven't seen it already, check it out. If you'd like, you can follow us on the socials. We have Crown Gilded and Screwed. We also have Mayward Productions, which is our production company. And of course, my social media will also pop up there on the screen as well. Thanks to our producer, again, my partner, Chaz McNeese. Thanks for saving my life. And thank you, of course, to our our editor, Resilio. And thanks, as always, to all of you. And we will see you again next time. Cheers.